artificial intelligence will completely transform our world. But what is AI? Why will it affect you? And how can you and your business survive and thrive through the AI revolution? Welcome to AI and You. Here is your host, author, speaker, and futurist, Peter Scott.
Hi, welcome to episode 215. My guest today is John Danaher, Senior Lecturer in Law at National University of Ireland, Galway, and author of the 2019 book Automation and Utopia, Human Flourishing in a World Without Work, which is an amazingly broad discourse on the future of work, ranging from today's immediate issues to the different kinds of utopia, or dystopia, depending on your viewpoint, ultimately possible when automation becomes capable of replicating everything that humans do. We're going to talk about how much jobs may be automated and the methodology behind studies of that, the impact of automation on job satisfaction, what's happening in academia, and much more. John has published over 40 papers on topics including the risks of advanced AI, the meaning of life in the future of work, the ethics of human enhancement, the intersection of law and neuroscience, the utility of brain-based lie detection, and the philosophy of religion. He's co-editor of Robot Sex, Social and Ethical Implications from MIT Press, and his work has appeared in The Guardian, Aeon, and the Philosopher's magazine. Let's get right into the interview. Well, John Danaher, it's a privilege to welcome you to AI and You, and we're going to talk a lot about your work in ethics as it relates to the automation of jobs, principally through AI, and the effects upon employment. Your book from 2019 is what inspired me to talk to you, Automation and Utopia, Human Flourishing in a World Without Work, which certainly puts a big stake in the ground that we're going to cover here. We certainly can't encapsulate your work in 1 hour, but can you give us a summarization of your role, your purpose, what you're doing?
Yeah, sure. And thanks for inviting me to be on the podcast, Peter. A privilege seems excessive, but I appreciate it nonetheless. So I'm primarily an academic researcher looking at the ethics of technology, and probably technology in general is what I'm interested in, but have focused a lot of my time and attention on AI and robotics in the past decade or so. Along with, it seems, most of my academic peers at this stage, the AI revolution has really subsumed the world of research as well. And I'm interested in a range of different topics, but one of the ones that I'm interested in is the impact of AI on work, particularly on some of the ethical dimensions of work, the kind of issues around control, management of people, freedom and autonomy in work, those kinds of ethical questions. And then also a broader set of questions around human flourishing and meaning in life and the impact of AI on the human capacity to flourish.
And that's where it starts to cross over into philosophy. And that crossover happens on a different timescale from the effects that we're observing now. I feel that the need that in our conversation, we might need to tag every prediction, every statement with a timeline for it. Because if we go back no more than 100 or so years, we have people like Keynes predicting that about now we shouldn't be working more than 15 hours a week and it would be pretty leisurely. And yet that clearly hasn't happened. We've gotten greatly more wealth. We have higher standards of living generally, but the pace of work is undiminished. And yet you are writing about a world where Keynes' vision does come to pass at some point in the future. That is a possibility that you discuss. So how do you reconcile the prediction of a world where work is all but obsolete with what we have right now, which in my experience and everyone else I know is as frantic as ever?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I suppose I should say that I always look at these things with a large sort of historical panorama in mind. And you're certainly right to point out that there are tremendous ironies and repetitions in historical debates around technology and work. I mean, Keynes certainly is one source you could point to writing 100 years ago, but you could also point to people writing even 200 years ago at the birth of the Industrial Revolution, the start of the Luddite movement and the concerns around work and displacement of workers. You could even go back further than that, by the way. You can find in ancient Greek philosophy, Socrates worrying about the invention of writing and the fact that we're writing everything down. This is making us lose certain human capacities, like the capacity for memory and thought. And these are very similar debates to the ones that we have nowadays about technology. And I mean, just one other sort of historical anecdote on work and leisure. So, Keynes and others, another influence on me would be something like Bertrand Russell, who wrote this essay back in the 1920s, I believe, in praise of idleness, about the value of not working for a living and getting by just with the kind of leisure class. His claim that the leisure class is responsible for all that is good in human history. There's a famous essay by an anthropologist, Marshall Salins, called The Original Leisure Class, or something along those lines, which is actually about hunter-gatherer tribes, that they lived the original leisure lifestyle, because people assume that if you're hunting and foraging for food, that you must be working all the time. But actually, based on studies of modern-day hunter-gatherer tribes, they don't spend a huge amount of time working, maybe 20 hours a week working. The rest of the time is taken over with more leisurely activities, socializing, community life, that kind of thing. And they also tend to work in fits and spurts. They don't have regular working days or hours. Sometimes there's a lot of activity, other times there's less activity. And his claim, and the claim of other anthropologists, is that really it's the invention of agriculture that leads to our kind of more modern systems of work, where you have work throughout the year, routinized work, and that becomes a kind of progressively more part of our lives and takes over more of our lives with the Industrial Revolution. Because at least with agriculture, you had ebbs and flows with the seasonality of the year. There were busy parts of the year and quieter parts of the year, whereas with the Industrial Revolution, people are just working all the time. So what's my point here? My point here is that if you look at the kind of this another grand historical narrative, birth of agriculture, Industrial Revolution, it seems like actually technology is responsible for more work being run into our lives and work taking over more and more of our lives than they used to when we were these kind of hunter-gatherer tribes. So people like me or others who opine about the impact of technology and work can seem very much out of tune with this historical narrative when we claim that technology will lead to much more leisure time or freedom, or the mass displacement of people from work, because, as you rightly point out, the opposite appears to be the case in many instances.
I'm thinking of what will be a large segment of our audience, given the demographics, people working in technology industries where you have things driven by the ethics like Steve Jobs at Apple during the development of the Macintosh, and people wearing T-shirts saying 90 hours a week and loving it. You have the companies run by Elon Musk, which are famous for incredible amounts of work. Someone asked him how much people should work if they want to change the world. I think the answer was somewhere around 80 hours a week. And every other industry where I'm familiar with people in it, in technology, these standards, again, in North America, at least, it's certainly different in Europe, are 60 hours a week as a minimum. So I think a lot of these people would listen to the idea that technology could automate away some of their job and say, bring it on. But the dichotomy is that everywhere I go to speak to people, the number one fear they have virtually everywhere is that they're going to lose their job to AI because they don't know what it's capable of doing. And that is what they're afraid of. And certainly the media amplifies that. We have had studies that are responsible for some of that fear, like the Osborne and Fry study out of Oxford Martin School, and resulting in, I think, 47% automation. You talk about that study. What is your opinion of the validity of that work and others with respect to how much impact automation is going to have on employment?
I think putting a precise, quantifiable measure on the amount of work that'll be automated, maybe it can be a useful heuristic or guide to how we think about the future of work. But I mean, to think that these figures are going to be in any sense accurate or representative of the future, I think is not accurate or not correct. I mean, the methodology behind most of those studies, and there are other ones as well that have been done, the World Economic Forum issues these reports every couple of years using a similar methodology, and McKinsey did a famous study back in 2016 that I remember reading closely at the time with a very similar methodology to is it Frey and Osborne study from 2014 or wherever it was, where essentially what they do is that there are these large databases of work tasks. Okay, so I mean, this is maybe the interesting thing from an analytical perspective and what I like philosophically speaking. You can talk about a few different things. You can talk about work, you can talk about jobs, and you can talk about tasks. Work is a very abstract phenomenon, what it actually means to work, what hard work is. And these tend to kind of raise people's hackles if you use the terminology on work and the automation of work, because people mean different things by it. I mean, in one sense, you could think of all physical activity as work, or anything that's difficult as work. That's another definition people have in their minds. And if you adopt those kinds of definitions, very broad, technology is never going to displace or change all work. People are always going to probably be doing something or other with their lives. So it might not be particularly useful to talk about work in that broad sense. I personally prefer a definition of work which is heavily sort of linked to modern industrial economies, which is that I think about work in an economic sense, which is performing physical or mental tasks in return for some kind of economic reward. And that's roughly the definition that I have in my book. Jobs then are roles that are defined within organizations, possibly within society more generally, that are collections of various tasks that people do on a daily basis to earn their bread and butter, to earn money. Teachers, fire people, doctors, lawyers, consultants, programmers. These are all job titles that people have. Social media manager is another kind of job title that somebody might have, which come with a set of defined tasks set out typically in an employment contract ultimately, I guess, but more abstractly, we think of them as being made up of reasonably definable tasks. And so there are these large databases that the US, I guess, Department of Labor, the Bureau of Labor Statistics collects these databases of tasks that people perform in different jobs across the economy. So, I mean, let me take my job as an example here. I'm an academic, so you could break that down into various tasks. Like I read things, I perform research, I write, I teach classes, I prepare those classes, I send emails, I schedule meetings with other people, I consult with students, I provide them with advice, I do some kinds of administrative tasks, which are a kind of mix of different things. I talk to the media, I give public presentations. So there's lots of different tasks that make up my job. An academic is some ways, maybe it's a somewhat typical example of a kind of knowledge job where there's lots of somewhat loosely defined or loosely collected tasks in it. There are other kinds of jobs that are just one task that people perform. Like if you're a taxi driver, there's pretty much only one thing you do as part of your job. Maybe you could say you talk to customers or something like that, and you have a friendly, personable manner, and that's part of your job as well. But essentially what you're doing is you're driving people from A to B, and there's nothing else that's part of your job. So anyway, go back to it. You can break all these jobs down into different tasks. And what they look at in the studies, like the McKinsey study or the Osborne and Frey study, is that they look at those tasks and they effectively do one of two things. They either hand code them, they get like teams of experts to say, which one of these tasks do you think can be replaced by a machine now or in the next 5 to 10 years or whatever time horizon they want to put on it. And you can say, yeah, writing ad copy, we know that generative AI can do that now, so that'll be replaced within the next 5 years. Whereas, cutting somebody's hair, no, I don't think, I'm looking at the latest developments in robotics, it doesn't seem that we have anything at the moment that can safely cut somebody's hair and style somebody's hair. All right, at least at the same level that a skilled hairdresser would be able to do that. And so that's what they do. Sometimes they do computer-based kind of algorithms that will go over these databases of tasks and then generate similar kinds of predictions. So that's essentially what they're doing. So behind those figures like 47% or 60% or 50%, all these different studies come up with different figures, is that basic methodology. And I think what I say in the book is that it's not like soothsaying, it's not like they're reading the entrails or something to predict the future, but it's not exactly hard predictive science. It's not like predicting the next coming of Halley's Comet or something like this. These are figures to be treated with a large degree of suspicion, I think.
Understood. How do you see the aspect of job satisfaction changing with automation? Because number one, priority for any job for people is to make a living, make enough to survive on. When they have the bottom part of Maslow's hierarchy covered, then if they get any satisfaction or fulfillment or purpose out of that job, that's a bonus, something that they can pursue then. Now, it seems that we have had generally more opportunities to enjoy job satisfaction at larger scales, but there are still plenty of jobs where it takes a vivid imagination to imagine that people are enjoying it, although certainly in some cases you can say they are. Some people are taxi drivers, to use your example, because they have no better choice. They don't like it. Some people are taxi drivers because that's their dream, to drive people around and talk to them all day. So there's a bit of a mix there. The utopians, people predicting that we're heading for a utopia of some kind through automation, would say that we're all going to move towards being able to do things that give us as whatever fulfillment that we're looking for, and that the money will be taken care of through compensation for doing that or through universal basic income. Do you see this generally playing out in that direction or something in a different direction?
I wanted to kind of just underline one thing that you just said, because I think it's important. I mean, you said that most people work in it primarily to earn a living, and that's the first need that they need to meet. And if they do that, it's good, and anything beyond that is a bonus to some extent. And that's an important way of framing work for a lot of people, because I think that there are people, and maybe they're the kinds of people that you and I associate with in our daily lives, to use a stereotype, typically more highly educated knowledge workers are often very strongly attached to their jobs. They view their jobs as, in many ways, kind of defining themselves, and they derive a lot of social value and meaning from their work. And they are often, not always, but often satisfied in the work that they do because it's creative, it pushes them, they feel that they develop in those roles. I mean, obviously, there are huge caveats associated with all of that. If you survey a lot of my academic peers, they probably would say that they're very unhappy in their jobs, and that's become an increasing phenomenon in recent years, which we could get into why that might be the case. And I think to some extent technology has a role to play in that as well. But, these are kind of just anecdotes or common sense that we're applying here to this interpretation. There are some statistics on how people feel about their work. And one set of statistics that I draw upon heavily in the book, Automation Utopia, is these Gallup surveys of global satisfaction in the workplace. I think it's called the State of the Global Workplace Report. They issue them every few years. When I was writing the book, I think I was relying on the 2017 report. And I'm just after looking up the most recent report in 2022. And the actual percentage of people who feel involved in and enthusiastic about their work globally is in the low 20%, And even in countries that are very strongly kind of wedded to the work ethic, when you might expect it to be higher, like maybe the US as a stereotype, it's still only in the 30%, right? So actually, if you break down these statistical reports, the majority of people are maybe so-so about their work, and there's quite a high percentage of people that are very unsatisfied in their work. So it's actually globally a minority of people that feel very enthusiastic about and involved in work. And I think that's an important way of framing it. As for the second question you have there about the utopian narrative around work, it would be great if technology just replaced or helped displace people from all the tedious and mundane tasks that they perform as part of their work and freed people up to do the more interesting, creative things, or the things that they derive more meaning and satisfaction from. But of course, that's not really the case in practice. And this is actually something that I think has been driven home now for people like me, I'd say knowledge workers, with the recent revolution in generative AI. The things that academics typically value as part of their work, maybe people derive satisfaction from teaching and maybe mentoring people, that kind of thing, supervising people and driving the next generation of researchers. But for a lot of people, the thing that they derive most satisfaction from is their research and their writing. And of course, the idea that a lot of that can be replaced by machines, at least in terms of for people like me, like Philosopher or Emphasis, you can generate reasonably credible papers through AI. And there's a whole bunch of scandals nowadays about academics who have essentially published papers that are heavily reliant upon the use of generative AI to produce those draft papers. If you go to Google Scholar and you put in a search term like, as of my latest update, or as a large language model, I'm unable to X, you'll actually find a lot of published academic papers with that text in it because, as it indicates, that academics are using this. So that's something that I think is threatening to the self-conception of a lot of knowledge workers, because these are the things that they want to do, that they derive satisfaction from. They'd like to maybe automate the mundane and tedious aspects of their job, but actually the technology that we've produced seems to be capable of automating the part of their jobs that many of them like the most, or that they feel most attached to in terms of their self-worth and self-valuation. And that's always been the history of technology in the workplace. It doesn't just replace the things that we would like it to replace that are dull and tedious, but it just replaces whatever is available in a sense. Like whatever the technology can do, that's what it'll do.
Right. I think someone popularized the saying, we wanted robots to do the laundry and dishes and give us time to do art and poetry, not the other way around. You mentioned academia a few times there, and you say in your book, quote, "This is not the place for a lengthy diatribe about the management culture in the modern university." So I want to give you the place for that. And the reason for that is that I think that there's a place in the future of work to discuss whether universities are fulfilling the role that all of us on the outside of that bubble would imagine is going on there, that we would think you're pursuing research into the most important topics of the effects of AI on education and of automation on the workplace, that this is conducted with the purest of scientific motives without regard for whether studies will yield negative results or simply to increase authors' numbers of citations solely to advance the sum of human knowledge. Okay, I'm larding it on a bit here, but I want to give you the space to help us understand exactly what role academia is or isn't and should be playing in addressing these issues.
Yeah, I mean, I have a very kind of idealistic and traditionalistic sense of academia, of what its role in society is, probably tied very much to the Humboldtian tradition in German kind of university educational theory, which, universities are there basically as custodians of knowledge of the past. We collect and curate the knowledge of the past and pass it on to future generations. I mean, knowledge in a very broad sense here, not just like, theoretical knowledge, but practical knowledge as well. And we also obviously drive forward the frontier of research. That's the idealistic vision of academia. I think, to some extent, modern universities, the ones that I have direct personal experience of working in, do retain some of that vision. And I think academics are notorious for complaining about their work conditions, but at least from my own personal perspective, I've been extremely fortunate in the roles that I have. I have a huge degree of autonomy and freedom over what I do, what I research, what I write about, that I can't imagine any of my peers in private sector employment ever having, for example. Maybe they have more money, but I'm pretty well paid for what I do. I essentially work as many hours as I want every day. And there are some demands of my time when I'm teaching, but actually not that many, relatively speaking. And I think I have some close friends who are lawyers in large corporate firms, and if they actually saw what I did on a daily basis, they would probably weep by comparison.
But if we take this to the outside of your personal experience to your experience of the broader academia world, could we tell ourselves that academia has got our back when it comes to understanding what's going on with automation and future of employment? Yeah,
I just inserting that kind of personal thing as a caveat, because I don't want to sound like I'm necessarily whining or complaining about my own position, since I think it's quite privileged, relatively speaking.
Understood.
Does academia have our back more generally? I think there's a lot of very good work being done on AI in society, AI in ethics, AI in law in academia. I think there's a lot of value to that. Whether it translates into public policy or change on the ground is another matter. I think there's possibly an oversaturation of people in AI ethics and AI society type research these days, and it's hard maybe for that research to find an audience or get attention because there's so much stuff out there. More generally, of course, I think that universities are struggling to an extent around the world. This is where you get into the kind of geopolitical, economic basis of modern academia. But effectively what happened in the mid-20th century was there was a huge explosion in higher education in many parts of the world. You see this very clearly in, let's say, the Anglo-American world in the UK and the US, Australia to an extent as well, and Ireland to a lesser extent, I should say, which is where I'm based. And a lot of those universities new universities were created, new programs were created, etc. And now that sort of boom in higher education is, or has been for a long time, it has sort of reversed the trend, and universities are struggling for money. They're competing for students. There's probably a diminishing international pool of students for universities to compete. You see it nowadays, universities shutting down, programs closing down. There's a very good guy, US-based researcher, Brian Alexander, on the future of education, who tracks the universities' closures. If you check out his blog, he's tracking all the universities that are closing in the US every month. There's quite a lot of them. And of course, there's another thing that happened, of course, in academia in the past 50 years or so is the kind of the rise of management, professional administration in academic universities, which has outsourced a lot of kind of teaching labor to part-time adjunct teachers who are employed under, I think, very dubious conditions. And there's a limited kind of core of elite, I guess in the US you'd call them tenured professors. Most other jurisdictions don't really have the concept of tenure, that do very well. Maybe people like me do very well, but the vast majority of people in academia, probably upwards of 70% of people who are actually employed in academia are often employed on short-term contracts with very limited benefits, limited rewards, and actually they don't really have the time or the resources to engage in research that helps us to kind of drive forward the future or get our backs, as you say, in relation to the future of technology. And of course, another part of this is that academics probably increasingly feel that what they do is under threat from technology. That's definitely true, I'd say, the last 2 or 3 years in particular.
How so?
I mean, the obvious thing is the generative AI revolution with the release of ChatGPT and subsequent models that, well, number one, threatens the educational mission of universities because universities assess students, and the degrees and rewards that we give to students is a core part of the value that we provide to students. There's a debate to be had about whether results in degree programs tell you something about what students learn on those programs, and I won't get into that debate. Some people think people don't really learn anything from universities, but the university degree has a powerful signaling value in an economy. But the assessment methods that most universities use nowadays are coming under threat. There's actually been a kind of retreat to classical methods of assessment. I see this in my own university, the timed exam that you do in person, because that's relatively safe from technological disruption. But as educators, we were told to kind of move away from that traditional exam assessment towards more creative, continuous assessment, essays, papers, that kind of thing. But all that is like easily gameable by technology nowadays, which is a shame for the students who, of course, are trying their hardest and are very honest in what they're doing. And I should say as well, there's debate to be had about how exactly you position students' use of generative AI in producing their assignments. Do you encourage it? Is there certain uses that are legitimate or not? That's been a huge disruptive event in life cycle of universities in the past. I guess November 2022, ChatGPT launched to the public, so not that long ago, but there's been a lot of soul searching and hand-wringing about what to do as a result of that. It's certainly the most disruptive thing that's happened on the educational side in my time working in universities. And as I already mentioned, it also affects the research side, the research production side.
That's the end of the first half of the interview. Next half next week. It was a very useful take for me on the methods in the 2014 Osborne and Fry study that famously concluded, as we said, that 47% of jobs were likely to be automated in the US. Given how much variation there has been in similar studies' conclusions, we could really use a lot more of those kinds of studies. In today's news, ripped from the headlines about AI, the Future of Humanity Institute closed earlier this year. They've always been one of the mainstays of research and focus on existential risk, with special attention to AI, thanks to being founded by Nick Bostrom, who was, of course, the author of the landmark 2014 book Superintelligence. Both Bostrom and FHI were at the University of Oxford. And Bostrom said in an email that, quote, "The closure is the culmination of process that's been playing out over several years. A pressure to conform began bearing down. We were administratively housed within the Faculty of Philosophy, even though the majority of our research team by this time were non-philosophers, and there was a death by bureaucracy." End quote. A statement on the FHI website claimed that Oxford had frozen fundraising and hiring in 2020, and that in late 2023 the Faculty of Philosophy decided to not renew the contracts of remaining staff at the Institute. FHI was a major force in the effective altruism movement, which propounds that people should focus their lives and resources on maximizing the amount of global good they can do. A statement from the FHI's final report is illuminating. Quote, "We did not invest enough in university politics and sociality to form a long-term stable relationship with our faculty." End quote. Words to live by. Bostrom has now resigned from the university. His most recent book came out earlier this year, Deep Utopia, Life and Meaning in a Solved World, apparently deliberately tilting in the opposite direction from the dystopian interpretation of superintelligence. Next week, we'll conclude the interview with John Danaher, when we'll talk about generative AI extending our minds, the Luddite fallacy and why this time things will be different, the effects of automation on class structure, and Taylor Swift. That's next week on AI and You. Until then, remember, no matter how much computers learn how to do, it's how we come together as humans that matters.
That's all for this episode of AI and You. Please leave a rating and comment and share with your friends. Get the book Artificial Intelligence and You and see more videos and articles at aiandyou.net. That's aiandyou.net, where you can also send us your questions. Thank you for listening.